All right, welcome again, everyone that's joining us. We're so excited to have you. My name is Therese Perlowski, and I work with the Presidential Primary Sources Project. I'll be your moderator today, so if you're having any technical difficulties or there's anything you need help with, you can reach out to me via the chat, and I'll do my best to help you. We're here today for a presentation. Our presentation today is Black Americans and the Great Depression, and it'll be presented by the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library and Museum. Elizabeth's here on their behalf. And then also Jeff will be joining us from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum later on. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet2, which is a company I work for, the National Park Service, and the National Archives. And obviously today we have our presidential libraries participating. Just a quick disclaimer before we get started. By participating in this distance learning session today, all of the participants are agreeing to be recorded, streamed, and archived as part of our program. All of our programs will be posted on our YouTube channel for the public to be able to view. All right, just to help better facilitate some interaction today, I just wanted to go over a few expectations. So most people who wanted to participate via video included that in their registration. And I've done my best to promote the people who included that so that we can see your video, which we're really excited about because it's always really fun to see everyone. If you do want to be on video and I haven't promoted you, feel free to chat me and I will work on promoting you. For students participating just via the audio only, so we can actually, you can answer questions via audio, just use the little raise hand icon to respond to a question when prompted, and we'll work on unmuting you and all that. And for anyone else that just wants to participate via chat, that's totally fine. Just make sure you locate your chat box. It kind of looks like a little caption icon, and you can use that to ask and answer questions from our presenters. We're really excited to have you participate. We want to have as much interaction and participation as possible, but just also be respectful of all of the interactive tools. You know, if you're on video, make sure that you are using the video just to, interact with us. For the chat box, please just only use that for questions and answers to our presenters. Try to keep any personal conversations out of that. All right, just another thanks for joining us. To be able to see all of our YouTube videos and for more information about our future programs, this is our website, and all the links to the videos will be there as well. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our presenters. Elizabeth.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Dinschel from the Hoover Presidential Library, and Jeff is with us too. And so I'm going to share my screen here so we can start looking at this. I'm going to ask you guys for questions in the chat box. If you're a teacher out there and you have a classroom, you can unmute yourself after you guys have kind of discussed as a class and have an answer. Today, we're going to be talking about Black Americans and the Great Depression. And a lot of times when we talk about the Great Depression, we're just talking like overall, what's happening in America in general. And it's rare that we get to really dig into how it was affecting different groups of Americans. So it's a really interesting topic for us. But first, we have to start with like the basics of the story. So whenever we talk about history, can anybody tell me, you can throw this one in the chat box, if we're going to understand and we're going to storytell and we're going to write about history, where is the very first place that we have to start? What do we have to understand before we can talk about a specific topic? Who out there can tell me? I can't see my chat box for some reason. Teresa, are we getting anything in the chat box? Because I can't seem to get to it.
You have to understand the time period.
You have to understand the time period. Yes, that's definitely part of it. So typically we call this the context of the event. So we have to know what's leading up to it, what laws are shaping this time period, how different people in the country and in the world are experiencing this moment in time. So we're going to start with context. And at this time, for Black Americans, culture is really growing across the country in a way that we'd not experienced before. So I want to start off talking about the Harlem Renaissance. It's this really important time in the 20s and 30s when Black culture is this movement that's just spreading all over the country. It's not limited to Harlem. It's in Florida, it's in Missouri, it's in Chicago, Illinois. It's happening everywhere. And the movement is really born from the Great Migration. And the Great Migration is this period of time where thousands, hundreds of thousands of African Americans move from the South to the northern parts of the country. And it's really important for us to understand why the Great Migration took place. Can anybody tell me, you can use the chat box, we can get in video, what are some of the reasons behind the Great Migration? Why did so many Black Americans leave the South and move to the North? Did get my chat box up, by the way. We're talking about the reasons for the Great Migration. Someone said the South was very segregated and they had Jim Crow laws. Exactly, very good. The South was just riddled with racism. There's Jim Crow laws, which were legal segregation, were all over the South. And the other problem was that crimes that were committed against African American people by white people were not being prosecuted either. And this included lynching. And this was a time for Hoover and for FDR where the opportunity was presented to sign anti-lynching laws, and they could have moved through Congress, and they were never passed through the Hoover or the FDR administrations. But the Harlem Renaissance was this movement that gave birth to new art, music, literature, and it wasn't just Black Americans that were experiencing it, white Americans were experiencing it as well, and accepting things like jazz and blues music that was written by Black artists. Black performers like Josephine Baker were breaking color lines and performing in white-only establishments. Literary greats like Langston Hughes, W.E. Du Bois, and Zora Neale Hurston, her picture's on the right, and I love her because I'm from Florida, gave a new perspective to the Black experience in America. And so I have a poem on here from Langston Hughes, and he's talking about Harlem. And can you guys tell me, this is a chat box question, is literature, music, and art considered primary sources when we're looking at history? Are they considered primary sources when we're looking at history? We're talking about art, literature, music. Yes, 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 absolutely. And the reason for that is it tells us about American life. And so like if we look at this poem here by Langston Hughes, he says, what happens to a dream deferred? And he's talking about in this poem how Black Americans had dreams that they could not realize, and how long should they have to wait to chase their dreams and to make them happen for themselves. And so he's really having this question with himself about the importance of moving forward with your dreams, or should you have to wait because society says you have to? So I want to throw a question out there. What were the laws regarding segregation in the 20s and the 30s, and where did they apply? So think about not just we're saying, oh, segregation, but what things specifically? How did it impact life for Black Americans in the 20s and the 30s? And your class can chime in. I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to talk about it and put things in the chat box as well. All right, I'm seeing some good answers roll in. People, so we're saying public places, school, transportation, libraries, saying people didn't have the rights they had today. There were poll taxes in the southern states that generally prohibited Black Americans from voting. These are all great answers, absolutely, and they are correct. Some of the other things that prevented was interracial marriages. So a Black American and a white American couldn't get married to each other. And the Jim Crow laws actually extended out into the West as well. And that's something we don't talk about as much, but it largely impacted Mexican Americans and Native Americans. And Native Americans were really the big one in the northern, western parts of the country. So like South Dakota, North Dakota, in the Oklahomas and Colorado as well. So these laws were used to discriminate against people all across the country, but mostly it impacted Black Americans in the South. So this is important because these laws are old at this point. We're talking about the 14th Amendment. And so this is an important part of the Constitution. And I want you guys to take a look at the 14th Amendment. And I put a quote from it up here. And it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So let's take a second here and really look at what this is saying. Does the 14th Amendment distinguish American citizens by race? Does the 14th Amendment ban discrimination when you're reading it like this? So write some answers in the check box or in the chat box here, and this is up here. But it says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. What do you guys think? Do you guys think that the 14th Amendment distinguishes by race? And does it ban discrimination? I'll give you guys about 2 minutes to think about that. So we're seeing it does not discriminate, it does not distinguish between race. Someone says it bans discrimination. Galileo 5th grade says there's no distinction and there should not be segregation according to the Constitution. So when we have a question about the constitutionality of a law that's passed, when it is disputed by a citizen or by a lawmaker or an entity, it goes through the courts, right, guys? So once it's gone through all of its appeals, the last place it's going to end up is in the Supreme Court. And so there is a Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson that comes out in 1896. And this is the law all the way up until the 50s. And so essentially what Plessy versus Ferguson is saying, they say, and there's just some important quotes in here, but I want to look at a few particular ones. It says the argument assumes that social prejudice may be overcome by legislation and that equal rights cannot be secured except by an enforced commingling of two races. If the civil and political rights of both races be equal, one cannot be inferior to the other civilly or politically. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put upon them the same plane. So this is really interesting. Now they're talking about races in different categories. So what they're saying in this is that Black Americans, in the eyes of the court, are equal politically. So they're saying they can vote, they can participate in politics, which we also know is very much not true in 1896 and even moving forward. But this is what the court is arguing. They're also arguing that civilly, African Americans are the same. So they're saying they can be represented in court. They are not deprived due process of law. All of those things are equal in the court's eyes. What the court is saying in this is that socially, Americans can decide that Black Americans are not equal socially, and legislation cannot force them to be socially equal. And this becomes the separate but equal doctrine. And this case, Plessy versus Ferguson, becomes the foundation for which the United States builds Jim Crow upon and enforces it for years. So what they're saying is that you can't deny someone the right to go to school because they are Black, but you can send them to their own separate school, and that is considered equal because they still have the opportunity to go to school. So I want to ask you guys a hypothetical question. Can separate ever be equal? Can separate ever be equal? No, we're seeing no. No, no. Can anybody tell me what case overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and it had to do with school segregation? Does anybody know? I'll give you another hint in a minute if someone doesn't pop up with it. The case was passed in 1954 and it integrated schools. Give you guys a minute to think about it. All right, it's Brown versus Board of Education, very good, in 1954. So all through the Hoover and the FDR administrations, we see legalized segregation across the country in education, in healthcare, in public places. More states in the North are not enforcing Jim Crow laws, but that does not mean that Black Americans were treated equally across the country. And I think that's a really important part of understanding Black history in our country, is that just because there wasn't laws saying segregation was illegal does not mean it wasn't happening. And sometimes what we see across the country even today is something that we call de facto segregation, where people segregate themselves because they feel better and safer. And so they shop in businesses that make them feel welcome. And oftentimes that means that there's segregation happening, even though it's illegal, but it's just, people feel like it's forced upon them. So that's really important to remember too. So we're talking about the Great Depression today. We have some context about what life is like for Black Americans at this time. So we need to kind of understand a little bit more context about the Great Depression. So let's talk about how the Great Depression started. Can you guys in the chat box give us just some of the causes that you know or that you think might have been contributing factors to the Great Depression? Anything you guys can think of, causes of the Great Depression. I see the stock market crash has come up. Someone says Treaty of Versailles and German payments. We see the banks crashed. Yeah, we're all moving in the right direction. So we see the stock market crash in 1929, shortly after Hoover is elected and comes into office. There's an overall global reduction in purchasing, which means that people aren't buying things all over the world, right? So we have, factories making stuff and nobody buying it. There's some weird economic policies happening with Europe, and someone brought up repayments for Germany, which definitely depressed their purchasing abilities. But there's also this tariff that passes during the Hoover administration called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And it really destabilized some of our trade agreements and import taxes and things like that that are coming into the country. There's the drought and the Dust Bowl that's happening. So across the country, we see that there's not enough rain coming. We see that there are crops that are not growing like they should. There's scarcity across the country for food. And this is all contributing as well, because not only do you not have food to eat or to sell in restaurants or grocery stores, but you also have farmers and people who worked in agriculture out of work now. And this is a really, really hard time, especially for people who lived in rural parts of the country that grew their own food. And then, of course, we have bank failures. Someone talked about banks making bad investments. That's definitely a huge part of it. I think Jeff will probably talk about that a little bit more. So I want to dig into Hoover now. And I want to start with unemployment, because this is really one of the first things that Americans start to feel about the Great Depression. And Hoover recognized that it was climbing. And in October of 1930, Hoover created the President's Emergency Committee for Employment, or PEACE, P-E-C-E. The committee would undergo several iterations, but the main purpose was to study what areas were surging with unemployment. Areas, he's talking about places, right? Coordinate state and local relief programs and develop methods for increasing employment in the private sector. And they wanted to facilitate state and local public works programs. So you guys have to remember at this time, we're talking about 1930 and 1931 specifically right now, there is no unemployment insurance, there is no Social Security, there is no food stamps, there is no social safety net. So if you lost your job, your family was in trouble. And a lot of these people moved into essentially like tents or shanties that they were building in streets and public parks. Does anybody know what they're called? I'm sure someone does. I'll let you guys add it into the chat box there while we keep talking. But while there's no direct funding for relief or jobs, peace wasn't very successful because the government's not allotting money to these social issues. So in August of 1931, Hoover reorganized peace into the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief, POUR, POUR, like you pour a drink. Someone said Hoovervilles, exactly. That's what they got called, Hoovervilles. We had Hoovervilles, Hoover blankets were like newspapers that you used to cover yourself up with. People ate armadillos. They called them Hoover hogs. Lots of fun Hoover names. So this piece is reorganized into POUR. And POUR kind of tried to expand on the work of peace, but it also implemented a national fund drive for unemployment relief. POUR raised significant sums, but the national relief drive proved not only inadequate, but it was counterproductive. As they started advertising they had funds, there was a race to apply for aid, and that really hurt POUR. They were unable to distribute as much aid as they needed to. So POUR they try to get funds out, but they're on the verge of collapsing. And so what I want us to do now is to take a look at some of the data that we used to develop where we were going to put aid. And so I have this great chart for us to look at up here, and it's a primary source. So we don't have anybody telling us what it is. So we have to look closely at this document for clues about information. So across the top, it says the proportion of population given relief in May 1929, May 1930, and May 1931. And if we take a look, I can get my little pointer here. We see here, it tells us the city, May, so these are the years, then families given relief, and it has the number of families, persons, and then homeless and transients. Ex-servicemen, so that means veterans, and specifically at this time, it's probably mostly World War I veterans, the number of cases and persons, mothers' pensions, and then it shows us down here the total number of persons given aid. And then here, this is a really important part of our Constitution. It's basing it off the population of 1930. So the Constitution says in every 10 years, we're going to count how many people are in the country, right? And some of the reasons that we do that is so we have congressional representation that is accurate, and that we know where relief funds and projects are going to go so the government can do the most good for the most people. And we see this here. They're talking about what percentage of the population of the country is given aid based on this 1930 census. And you can look straight down here and real quick, because we're looking at data, we want to take in as much as we can. You can see this first number, which represents 1929, is always much lower than this third number, which is 1931. And this is a huge increase, 2.3% of the population to 6.1% of the population. That's more than double the number of people needed aid between 1929 and 1931. And then we can even scroll down further to the total here, and it goes from 1.3% of the population to 4.6 total. So the amount of people needing aid at this time is growing exponentially. And you can take a look at some of these cities listed here. There's some big cities, Chicago, Illinois, Cleveland, Ohio. And something else we can notice about these is these are all cities that are in the North and the Midwest, right? So these cities were places where a lot of people in the Great Migration went to. So if we notice, one of the things we talked about is these committees being born. We're talking about this data. What is this data not telling us? What is it not telling us? It is not telling us who is being harmed the most by unemployment and by the Great Depression. Like, it's telling us this number, 4.6%, but it doesn't tell us, are they children? Are they Black Americans? Are they white Americans? Are they people in urban centers? Are they people in rural centers? We don't know a lot of information. We just have numbers. And this is kind of the problem with looking at data to interpret anything. Without the context for it, we don't understand it fully. So now we're going to look at another piece of evidence that we have. And we're going to look at the second page in the interest of time. But this is a letter to Herbert Hoover from Walter White. He's the secretary of the NAACP. And we can see some clues here that this letter is from 1931. And I want to take a second to look at this second paragraph specifically. You can see where my little red marker is. And one of the things it says is, we ask the appointment of Negro members to the committee. He's talking about poor, if possible, in proportion to the Negro population and the acuteness of the Negro workers' problems. So what he's saying is, if in Chicago, Illinois, if 25% of the population is African American, then they should have 25% representation of Black Americans on this committee. He says this is requested not because they are Negroes, but because of the special problems which the Negro worker confronts over and above those which are encountered by American citizens generally. In the recent report of the National Urban League, How Unemployment Affects the Negro, for example, it is pointed out that in Baltimore, Negroes form 17% of the population, but 31.5% of the unemployed. That's enormous, okay? In Chicago, Negroes form 4% of the population and 16% of unemployed. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the proportions are 20% and 54%. In Memphis, Tennessee, 38% and 75%. In Philadelphia, 7% and 25%. And he goes on and on and on and on. He says, these figures are sufficiently typical so that an average of them would give us a fair picture of the extent of suffering among Negroes throughout the country. This acute distress, which unquestionably will be more serious when cold weather comes, is leading to very great unrest among Negroes and is offering a fertile field for communist propaganda. In the interest thereof of not just of Negroes who are suffering, but in the larger interest of good government, we urge such appointments so that Negro legal citizens may understand that their plight is not being ignored by those in authority. So do you guys think, this is a question back to you guys, do you think Walter White is correct in stating that Black Americans should have representation on the Poor Committee because they understand the situation that impacts them better? What do you guys think? Do you think that I'm seeing yes coming back? Yes, they should. So part of the problem at this time with presidents and receiving letters is we have secretaries playing goalie. And I'm sure Jeff can talk about that too. There are letters that will never make it to the president's desk. And there is no indication that this letter ever made it to Hoover's desk. But looking back, being able to stand back and see how important this letter was and see how important these statistics were and this study was that he cited, we can see that this is a grievous error, egregious error on behalf of Hoover's secretaries. And in history, we can see how this had long-term impacts in the country for Black Americans. So another thing that happened during Hoover's time that was depression for the World War I veterans were promised a bonus when they served. And they demanded an early payout of the bonus, and it was not going to be awarded to them. So they descended upon Washington, D.C. This was called the Bonus March. And you can see from the advertisement, Black and white soldiers alike were invited to DC. And very much against Jim Crow laws, the camps were fully integrated. Black veterans traveled, camped, ate, and fought alongside the white veterans. The outcome was not great, but the significance of this fully integrated protest is often overlooked as a minor detail when we talk about the bonus march. But this really was an important time. So now let's look at the transition from Hoover to Roosevelt. The banking crisis we talked about is worsening between the election and inauguration. And Hoover was the last president inaugurated on March 4th. They shortened that amount of time between election and swearing in because this period was so horrible, and Congress and the president were really unable to push forward any meaningful aid to the American public. Congress would not enact Hoover's plans that he'd asked for, and Hoover ultimately turned to Roosevelt and asked for his help. And FDR, my impression was like, I don't want to get stuck with Hoover's problems on my hands. We'll wait till I'm president. And with that, I want to hand it over to Jeff.
Oh, Jeff, I think you're muted.
You are muted, Jeff.
How's that, better?
Yep, now we can hear you.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm Jeff Urbin from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. I'm delighted to be with you all today. And I think Elizabeth has done a fantastic job, as always, laying out the framework for this discussion. You know, one of the points she makes is this idea of context, and context is incredibly important in history. You know, people will often say, well, why don't we just, why didn't, Roosevelt or Hoover just wave a magic wand and then, fix everything? Well, it doesn't work that way. And what these guys were up against during this time frame, as Elizabeth has pointed out to you with some of the documentation, is an incredible sense of racism that was going on in this country. And it's always frustrating to me as a teacher and as an historian when you talk to people and they say, well, I don't know why they just didn't do this, or why didn't they just do that? And the question I would ask is, or the advice I would give is, let's look at today, right? Look at what's going on today. Look at the racism in this country. Look at the anti-Semitism in this country. Look at, the divisions that we have in this country today in 2021, and now back it up to a time before a Black president, President Obama, back it up to a time before a Black Supreme Court justice, back it up to a time before, the breaking the race barrier in sports, breaking of the race barrier in entertainment, backing it up all the way to, prior to the 1950s and 60s civil rights movements, people like Martin Luther King and so forth, and you'll get a sense of just how bad things were in the time of Hoover and Roosevelt. I want to jump in right here. Elizabeth has just given you that letter from Walter White, 1931, asking that more Negroes be put onto these committees and such. And as Elizabeth makes the point, it's hard to know if the president ever saw this. Now, President Hoover would sometimes get as many as 5,000 letters a week. President Roosevelt got as many as 5,000 letters a day. He needed 26 secretaries to handle all of his correspondence. So obviously it was difficult to get information into the White House and then directly to the president. But he did look at a lot of correspondence and such that came in, and it's again difficult to know what got to his desk or what didn't get to his desk. But I have here a letter from November 22nd, 1941. It's actually a memo for the president from Mrs. Roosevelt. And I'll hold that up right here for you. Now, these you can get on if you go to our website. I'm doing it old school. But basically, this is November 1941. So this is a full 10 years after the letter that Elizabeth showed you. And Mrs. Roosevelt is once again asking that African Americans, Negroes, the term used at the time, be put onto these positions and put into these places so that they can give their perspective on what's going on and what's happening, in the country. And the president says he Mrs. Roosevelt gives a response. President Roosevelt gives a response to Mrs. Roosevelt, and then she sends this back. She says, "I spoke to the president about your desire to have a colored person appointed to the position where he could confer on problems pertinent to Negroes. And he says he feels it is unwise to appoint people definitively as to any race or creed. I think, therefore, it is better to have a white person who is sympathetic." So this is a memo back from Mrs. Roosevelt having discussed that issue with President Roosevelt. And this may look like, it's a big fat no, right? But what Roosevelt is saying here is that the appointment of an African American or a Negro to these committees, to these places of prominence, is going to meet with opposition. And even if you have someone with dark skin on these committees, on these meetings, in these positions, a large variety of folks aren't going to listen to them, because it's going to be, where's the message coming from? Now, it makes perfect sense, and it's totally right, that these are the folks that would have a better perspective on what is going on in their community. However, most folks are not going to listen if it's coming from a Black voice. It needs to come from a white voice, and this is what Roosevelt is saying as late as still 1941. Now, there's an old saying that a dream delayed is not a dream denied. Right. So if I'm telling you that you can't have something now, it's not that I'm telling you you can't ever have it. But think about that for a minute, right? Let's say you're 8 years old and your folks say, yeah, someday we'll go to Disney World, right? Well, how does that make you feel as a kid? You want to go to Disney World now, right? Well, maybe next summer. Well, maybe 2 summers from now. Well, maybe when your brother graduates, right? Well, that doesn't make you feel any better. And that's exactly how many African Americans were feeling. And Elizabeth points out the fact that, they felt that they had waited long enough, and they felt that they had, put up with enough. The Civil War was over in 1865. You got the 14th Amendment. Hey, let's make it happen. All right. These rights have been given to us, technically, but they haven't been given to us actually. And we want to move this forward. Now, Roosevelt, the Roosevelt record on race is a story of definite interest, but not necessarily definite immediacy. And what I mean by that is Roosevelt was more and more sympathetic to the plight of African Americans, especially during the Great Depression. Now, you have to understand that Roosevelt was a man of his time, right? He grew up at a time when there was a lot of racism in the country, as I just pointed out. And, he was a product of some of that just as much as anybody else was. But the Roosevelts also understood that you had to overcome that when a stomach is hungry, it doesn't matter if it's a Black stomach or a white stomach, it's somebody hungry. And if somebody is suffering, it doesn't matter if they have white skin or Black skin, they're suffering. And as Elizabeth points out, that some of these causes of the Great Depression, we always talk about the Great Depression as if it were an economic problem only, but it was so much more than an economic problem. The stock market crash on October 29 was just like waking up in the morning with the fever, right? For days before you woke up with the fever, you weren't feeling so good. But then you wake up one morning, mom sticks a thermometer in your mouth, and she says, oh, you've got a fever of 103. No kidding, Mom. I could have told you that. I've been not feeling good for the last 3 days. But that's what gets the attention. Then Mom's, oh, I better call the doctor. So that's what happened with the stock market crash. But it was more than just an economic problem. It was a problem of spiritualism, and it was a problem of emotionalism. People lost hope. People lost faith. Families collapsed in on themselves. If you had a 16, 17-year-old brother, he might be asked to leave the house. Right? We don't have enough food to feed you and baby sister. You got to go make it on your own, pal. And this is where the hobo culture begins to come in. If you had grandma and grandpa living on their own, maybe they can't make it anymore. They move in with you because things were so bad that all of the resources in the country had been scraped. Usually back in the day, if you had a problem, let's say an economic problem, you might turn to a rich uncle, or a rich grandparents. Hey, Uncle Bob, can you help me out until I get back on my feet? And Uncle Bob could do that. But the problem with the Great Depression was that Uncle Bob was feeling it too. Uncle Bob had lost his money as well. So then you might turn to your church or your synagogue, but they were tapped out as well. So then you might turn to some sort of, community organization, a Salvation Army, Goodwill, somebody like that, but they were tapped out as well. So you might turn to your county, but they were tapped out as well. And then you might turn to your state, but they were tapped out as well. So the only people that could really approach these problems was the federal government. And that's where the switch really occurred. Hoover was a good guy. Hoover was a self-made millionaire. Hoover was a guy who cared about people. Hoover was a guy who understood that people were suffering during the Great Depression. But the problems that were being experienced by people in the Great Depression were simply too large for anybody to handle. Roosevelt had a little bit of an advantage. He had been the governor of the state of New York during the first 4 years of the Great Depression. So he had tried out a lot of little experiments here in New York State, which later become the New Deal. And I want to point out this chart. So you've seen the periodic table of the elements. Well, here's the periodic table of the New Deal. And there were over 44 programs of the New Deal created to help people through the Great Depression. This is the kind of activity that needed to be done. And President Hoover just wasn't thinking that way. He was a conservative guy. He believed in a conservative approach. Nothing like the New Deal had ever been tried before. So it was a little bit outside of the box for what he was thinking about. And Roosevelt, as I said, had the advantage because he knew many of these programs would work, at least to some degree, because they had worked here in New York State first. So things like the Civilian Conservation Corps tried here in New York State first. Tennessee Valley Authority tried here in New York State first with the St. Lawrence water project in the northern part of the state. Fireside chats, right? Talking to people and telling them what the problems were and then having them respond back to you, tried out here in New York State first. The Works Progress Administration tried out as experiments here in New York State first. So Roosevelt understood that yes, people needed a job because they needed money in order to stimulate the economy. But more importantly, they needed a purpose, right? They needed to have something to do. And so the job programs that Roosevelt created were designed to bring about, yes, a paycheck, but more importantly, a purpose, a sense that government was doing something, a sense that something was happening. So Roosevelt, this was the immediacy of the problem that Roosevelt was facing. How do I keep the country from going communist? How do I keep there from being a revolution? How do I keep there from being a collapse? We can't turn to other countries in the world because it's a global depression. So it's not even like we can ask England to bail us out. We've got to solve this problem ourselves. And unfortunately, with African Americans being only about 13 million people in the population, Roosevelt was focused on the bigger population. He was, how do I get people back to work, right? Not 13 million people, but 130 million people. How do I get these folks back to work? Remember that unemployment was 25% on average. It was as high as 60% in some places and in some industries. Now, Elizabeth talks about the Great Migration, and this was really, really important because the African Americans were moving from the South, where they were up against these Jim Crow laws, the segregation, moving into the North, where things were better, not great, but better. And so what this meant was that there was a political shift. And the Democrats recognized this, and the party of Lincoln, which African Americans had been part of because Lincoln freed the slaves, they began to turn their back on the Republicans. The Republicans also had a huge stench that hung around them, and it was the Hoover stench. Sorry, Elizabeth, but people felt, hey, you know what? Hoover didn't do enough. Hoover, was causing these problems. That's why they were calling it, Hoovervilles, right? And a lot of this was unfair. Okay, a lot of this was unfair because the forces that came about to bring the Great Depression were not at all in any way, shape, or form President Hoover's fault. And the efforts that he made toward helping people was just a little too little, a little too late. You needed that massive infusion by somebody that felt like the government should be doing this stuff, which Hoover didn't really feel, and who had some experience with this stuff, which Hoover didn't quite have, right? As late as 28, Hoover's still saying, we'll get rid of the poorhouses, in no time at all. And then the stock market crashes, and there you go. So what does that mean for African Americans? Well, President Roosevelt wanted to get the country moving again. And so they were left out, African Americans, in a lot of the early New Deal programs. However, there were actually three advocates for African Americans at this time. One of them was Harold Ickes, who was the Interior, Department of Interior cabinet leader. What he did was he saw the shifting demographic in African Americans, and he was very much an advocate of saying, hey, you know what? This is a political group that we can begin to tap into. And Roosevelt, being a savvy politician, said, hey, that's a great idea. We need to do that. So you had Harold Ickes. You also had Harry Hopkins. And Harry Hopkins was in charge of the Works Progress Administration, and he made sure that there were quotas that African Americans were hired into these programs. Now, the problem goes back to what something that Elizabeth pointed out, was that these New Deal programs were administered in large measure at the state level. So Roosevelt gets the credit because he's created these giant, federal programs, but the real administration happens down at the state level. And the reason for that is because, just like in any town, right, there's that one family that gets everything done. You got something done, go talk to Mr. Johnson, man. They're all plugged in, they're all connected. You notice there's the one family that's always getting arrested. Right? Oh, go talk to them. There was a crime in town. Oh, that'd have been that McGillicuddy boy, right? So, there's people in these towns that you can go to for resolution of issues, and you can't go to. And so Roosevelt felt that the best way to get these programs up and running were to let it be done locally, where you knew that you go to the Johnsons to get stuff done. Now, unfortunately, a lot of this local implementation led to Blacks being excluded early on. So the Roosevelt record on race really was one that had, it could best be described as a balance between what could be done and what should be done. Okay, clearly, along the other third advocate I forgot to mention was Mrs. Roosevelt, who was constantly pushing President Roosevelt for, advances in, programs and the aid to African Americans. And the problem with President Roosevelt was that he was walking this fine line. Throughout the 1930s, 20s and 30s, 40% of the Congress was made up of Southern Democrats. And so what this meant was you couldn't antagonize the South if you wanted to get anything done. So if you move too quickly on civil rights, if you move too quickly on advancing the rights of African Americans, you would lose that Southern base as a political base. And Roosevelt understood that he needed to have them in order, the Southern groups, in order to have leverage in getting things through the Congress. So Roosevelt was working this very fine balance, trying to register African Americans in the northern cities to vote for Democratic. And he walked this fine line between giving African Americans enough that they would come over to the Democratic Party and felt that they were getting some help, but not giving so much that he would antagonize and alienate the Southern Democrats. And so there were a few very large public steps toward, equality during the Roosevelt era. One of them, of course, was the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II, because the war gave the president some cover politically. Because the war was such a traumatic, event and a disaster that needed to be resolved right away, the president could say, look, we need every able-bodied man, woman, and child, I don't care what color they are, get them in a factory, get them in the army, get them working, get them fighting. We need these folks to help us out. And you get very little argument, about that. As you might as Elizabeth was saying, some of this cultural stuff, the cultural stuff was coming along, but you couldn't legislate people to not be prejudiced, right? But you could activate people to get into these military positions. So you had the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-Black squadron of fighters. You had Executive Order 8802, which desegregated the military industries, allowing African Americans to have jobs in the defense industries, which made a huge improvement in their lifestyle. And here I have a little memo from FDR, and he's talking about the fact that there's not enough African Americans being advanced in these defense industries. So he says here, to order taking Negroes up to a certain percentage in factory order work, judge them on quality. First-class Negroes are turned down for third-class white boys, FDR. Okay, so what Roosevelt's saying here is, no, it's not about what color they are, it's about what they're able to do. And so he begins to advance this. So these are some behind-the-scenes things that Roosevelt is doing. The major things that people see are the Tuskegee Airmen, the desegregation of the defense industry, and Mrs. Roosevelt goes and flies with an African-American pilot, and it was official United States government policy that African Americans were really only qualified to peel potatoes and drive in the motor pool, in terms of military service. The Tuskegee experiment gave these guys the ability to fly, and they proved themselves to be incredible pilots. So there were some major advances on the outside, Tuskegee, the desegregation of the military defense plants, and Marian Anderson, when Marian Anderson was supposed to sing at the Constitution Hall and they wouldn't let her because she was Black, Mrs. Roosevelt resigned her membership in the DAR, and a concert was staged on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Those were the big things that were going on. Behind the scenes, Roosevelt was taking a great number of steps. He had a Black cabinet, a group of African Americans who he would turn to for advice. He would turn to for information about what was going on in the Black community, and then he would take their ideas and begin to implement them slightly and slowly into the policy for the United States. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, employed 350,000 Black workers. 15% of the total population working in the WPA were Blacks. The CCC were 3% in 1933, and by 1938 it was 11%. Now this stuff wasn't making front page news because he didn't want to antagonize the Southern congressman, but he was making his inroads this way. Elizabeth talked about the cultural revolution, the Black cultural revolution. This was critically important because Roosevelt built upon this with projects within the WPA. Federal One was a project that gave unemployed actors and writers jobs, acting out plays, and writing guidebooks and things for states. And a huge number of folks that were in this project were African Americans because, they were able to do these projects without, attracting a whole lot of, broad attention at first. And so the music projects, theater projects, writing projects, these all had a huge African-American influence. They hired Blacks to do this. FDR was the first to appoint a Black federal judge and to promote a Black officer to brigadier general. And FDR tripled the number of Blacks in federal employment. Now, what the Federal One project did was it built upon that cultural renaissance that Elizabeth was talking about, and it gave African Americans inroads into the theater and inroads into entertainment. So you had people like Joe Louis, who was the boxing heavyweight champion. You had people like Lena Horne, who was an African American singer, and these folks were beginning to perform with people like Frank Sinatra, right? A white singer and performer. So the cultural barriers and the racial barriers began to be broken down in these cultural things such as plays, writing, and musical entertainment. But it still hadn't crossed over to the mainstream of America. But these were important beginning inroads. So you could say, well, Roosevelt didn't do enough, or he should have done more. But I would argue that Roosevelt did exactly what he was able to do, given this delicate balance between what could be done and what should be done. And although he was definitely interested in advancing the rights of African Americans throughout the Great Depression, he saw the need to stabilize the economy for America, not Black America or white America, but for America. And then when the war comes along, the idea of we have to save democracy, not democracy for Black Americans or white Americans, but democracy. And Roosevelt was able to find ways to make inroads for African Americans, first through the Great Depression programs of the New Deal, and then secondly through the military. So it becomes a relatively simple step for Harry Truman to integrate the entire military, since Roosevelt a few years earlier had integrated the defense industries. And so much of the foundation of the civil rights programs of the 1950s and the 1960s were laid during the Roosevelt administration, during that 12-year period. And if you look at conditions for African Americans in 1929, and you look at conditions for African Americans in 1945, are they where they should be? No. Have they made huge advances? Absolutely. And then that becomes an advancement on. You must understand the context of the time. As Elizabeth pointed out, there was a lot of racism at the time. There was only so much Roosevelt could do. And, you know, again, he didn't sign the anti-lynching law because he knew that would antagonize all the Southern Democrats. And it wasn't that he was in favor of lynching. Lynching is murder. And there were state statutes in every single state against murder. So it was up to the local authorities to follow through on that. So takeaways are, keep in mind the context, keep in mind the racism that still exists to this day, even though we've been chipping away at it for 3/4 of a century or 150 years, depending upon where you want to start your demarcation. And imagine back up today to then, and you can see how much was still there. And so when you look at what was the progress that was made, it was actually quite remarkable for the time period that it was. And we still have a long way to go. We need to remember that we're standing on the shoulders of the folks that have come before us, and we need to constantly push that barrier. We need to constantly keep that momentum going. As I said, Roosevelt had this as an interest. It was not, an immediate thing that he was going to put to the top of his agenda, but it certainly was in his agenda, and we need to keep that moving forward. And if you go to our website, the FDR Presidential Library website, go to educators, go to teaching tools, and you can find information of the documents that I've been presenting here in those places. You can also find some curriculum guides there, and you can also find a little 28-minute video on the Tuskegee Airmen, which talks about their advances in fighting prejudice, not just in the skies over Europe, but on the ground here in the United States as well.
Yay. Does anyone have any questions for me or Jeff before we wrap it up today? Oh, there's the link for FDR. We have some stuff on our website as well. It's not quite as easy to navigate, but there is a Google Doc with that data sheet and with that letter, and you guys can work on comparing those and answering some compelling questions together about them.
And remember, everybody, the United States of America has always been an experiment, right? The goals and the ideals put forth in the Declaration, these are a goal. These are things we want to reach. It's not something that we have right away, but the idea is to make a more perfect union, right? We, the people of the United States, in order to, create a more perfect union. So we're constantly making it more perfect. We're constantly moving in that direction. There will be advances, there will be slides. There'll be advances, there'll be slides. But as long as there are more advances than there are slides, we're moving in the right direction. And the very fact that we're even still talking about this speaks to two things which are diametrically opposed. One is, why are we still talking about this? The Civil War ended 160 years ago, 180 years ago. This stuff should have been resolved by now. But on the other hand, it hasn't been, and we're still working on it. And that's the beauty of America.
Thank you, everyone. Someone asked Jeff, as an aside, how did Miss Roosevelt feel about the Japanese internment situation?
How did Mrs. Roosevelt feel about that?
Yeah.
She was not at all in favor of it. She was totally against it. And the president told her, listen, you can't be speaking out about this. We need unity in the country here in this time of crisis. So what she did was she worked, as these Roosevelts often did, behind the scenes to try to advance the rights of Japanese Americans who were interned as well. And I'm glad you raised that point, because that's another one of these magic moments in history where it just looks like FDR said, hey, you round up all the Japanese. That's not what happened. There was an 8-week debate in Washington from the attack at Pearl Harbor to the issuing of the executive order in February of 1941. What do we do about this? The State Department said, hey, these guys are American citizens, but they may have relatives that were Japanese nationals. The Justice Department was saying, these are American citizens. They haven't done anything wrong. They weren't the people flying the planes. The military said, hey, we just got caught with our pants down at Pearl Harbor. We're not letting something like this happen again. Get these guys off the streets. And Roosevelt gave the Executive Order 9066, which allowed the military to create exclusion zones. And the military kind of went berserk with that, and they created just 2 exclusion zones, one the entire west coast of the United States, and the other a partial and portion of the southern United States. And that's where the Japanese American internment came from, which is a whole nother story for a whole nother day. Anybody else? Does Klaus have his hand up?
Yeah, Klaus, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you so you can ask your question, okay?
Yeah, the population of proportion, that document you showed earlier on during when we were talking about the Great Depression.
Mhm.
Do we still make them?
Yeah, of course. We actually collect a lot of data across the country about different things. And a lot of them are available if you go to some of the government sites. Like right now, the pandemic is really interesting. So there's lots of data sets from the CDC there. The census websites also have really good data about where people are living and the demographics and how many people are in households. And we can tell a lot about history from data that we collect like this through the government and through agencies. So I encourage all of you to look for that stuff, because it's a part, like when we put stories together for history, everything's a puzzle piece, and that's just one piece, but it's really important. Like you can see it's important. It's really interesting. So definitely look for those. And if you go to the Google link that Therese shared in the chat, the Google folder, you can look more at this document on your own.
Awesome. Well, I think we're at time. So thank you so much, Elizabeth and Jeff, for sharing your time and your expertise. And thank you everybody who attended today. We're really excited to have you. And please check out our future programs.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everybody.